go to the scriptures and look and use a number of examples on fasting and the experiences that individuals had in fasting. But first, we'll go back to the basics of what fasting is, what it means, and to those of you, there's not so many this morning, that recently come from the Amish, we heard that a fast was given, And actually the initial word is fast. It comes from the Dutch word, fast. And of course the English is fasting. So yeah, it's another thing I noticed in the history of fasting, in the early and mid-1800s, it was used quite a bit. Toward the late 1800s and the early 1900s, not so much so. In the mid-1900s, very little. And then later, in the late 1900s and 2000s, you hear more about fasting. But anyway, simply is abstinence of something. Primarily, we think of food. We deprive ourselves of eating. Now, if I know, and I think I'm right, most of us, all of us, love to eat. A lot of times, we live more to eat than eat to live. But anyway, it's an abstinence of food, drink, for religious or ethical reasons. It can be complete, it can be partial, it can be lengthy, it can be short. There's many different ways to fast. In today's world, it's more than fasting just from food. There's a fast of social media. There's a fast from the news. As for me, I love to keep up to date with what's happening in the world. A fast of news and media is a good experience. Matter of fact, it has been mine for the last week or so. But anyway, it clears your mind of all the influence that we have from the news. A fast can be, when you think about food, it can be a meal a day. It can be a day a week. It can be a partial fast. It can be a 3-day fast. It can be a group fast. And that's what we usually do, like during an ordination or a special great need in the church. We have like a church fast. We have a group fast, which is very good. What does fasting do? We think a lot of fast food, but this is the opposite. We have a fast of no food. A spiritual fast, one we do for spiritual benefits, must be replaced with time spent on spiritual endeavors. If it's not, it's just skipping a meal or you're on a diet. A fast will bring us a deeper relationship with God. There's health benefits to fasting as well. It'll clear your mind. It'll cleanse your body if the fast is long enough. So there's many benefits in fasting. And like said, I'm not the person to give you many examples of that. What I'm saying to you today, I'm saying to me first, because fasting is not an easy thing for me. So we'd like to go to the scriptures now. And by the way, this is supposedly a Sunday school period. Sometimes I'm going to sound like I'm preaching to you. And if that's the case, you can stop me, or you can exit if you want to. But at any time, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I don't have a designated time for questions. If we get time, We might at the end, but if you have a question about something, just raise your hand or ask the question, and we'll try to go with that. Is fasting commanded in the Bible? That's a question. Is fasting commanded? Not really. It's strongly advocated, but it doesn't say that you must or you shall fast. Matthew 6, I'm going to read that portion about fasting. Jesus speaking, Matthew 6, verse 16, he says, when you fast. So the idea is you do fast. So when you fast, he says, do not as the hypocrites do, wearing a sad countenance in the public, so that you may appear to be fasting, that people may see that you're depriving yourself of something, you're suffering. So, no, Jesus said, don't do it that way, because that's going to be your reward. That's the extent of it. The attention that you draw to yourself at that time, that's it. There's no benefit beyond that. But he said, when you do fast, anoint thine head, wash thy face, that thou appear not unto men to fast, but unto thy Father which is in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Now when he says, anoint thee and wash thy face, that's just a normal hygiene, is what he's saying. Just be normal. Excuse me, in the public. He says the Father, and we'll see this as we get into the scripture, we'll see that fasting is what we do in relation to God and not to other people. The Pharisees, they fasted twice a week. Remember the incident of the Pharisee and the tax collector? The Pharisee stood and said, Lord, I am thankful that I'm not like other people. I give tithe, I fast twice a week. Look at me, Lord. See what I'm doing? Tax collector said, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus said, not to fast. It's a personal thing with you and your Lord. And like I said, there's times when we have a group fast, a church fast. But anyway, now we're going into the Old Testament. Those were negative aspects of fasting. Going to the positive side, we're going to 1 Samuel, and I'm not going to turn to all these scriptures, but 1 Samuel, Hannah was fasting. She had a personal grief. She was without a child. And to her, this was a personal grief. So she asked the Lord. She begged and she fasted and prayed and asked for a man-child. And Lord, if you give that man-child to me, if you bless me with that, I'm going to give him back to you. Eli, the priest, Hannah was praying, only her lips was moving, there was no sound. She was praying from the heart. Eli, the priest, accused her of being drunken. Hannah said, no, my Lord, but I have poured out my heart to the Lord. That was her response. It was a personal thing for Hannah. Remember these incidents as we go through them, and at the end of this, let's go back and think of what is a common thread that was in each one of these incidents. There's several, but there's a commonness here that these people had as they fasted and prayed. And I don't know what you're going to get out of this, and I don't know what you were expecting from this, but let's go through these accounts and see what the Bible has to say and what these people experienced. So that was Hannah's experience. Now we go to the Esther in the Old Testament. Here we have a nation, a people that has been pronounced to be destroyed, utterly eradicated. Hannah, or Esther, And we won't go into the details, but she was queen at the time, but she was part of these people that were to be destroyed. So Mordecai, her uncle, asked her to step before the king, which was not in order at all, as far as the rules of the Medes and Persians was, but he asked her to go before the king and plead for her people, for their people, the Jewish people. Esther said, proclaim the fast. She said, everybody fast 3 days. The whole nation of the Jewish people fast 3 days, and I will go into the king. And if I perish, I perish. So in this case, Esther gave her life, in the sense she was given up to give her life, but they proclaimed a fast and prayer for this occasion. Again, it was a time of drawing close to God. Let's go to Samuel. Here we have a call for national repentance for the Jewish people. They had strayed, they had backslidden. So they drew water and they poured it out before the Lord and in fasting and prayer, and they drew this water and poured it out before the Lord. And this was symbolic of pouring themselves out before God. And note that as we go through this, they were pouring themselves out before God. Esther had said, if I perish, I perish. Hannah said, no, my Lord, I'm not drunk, but I poured out my soul to you. Let's go to Moses in Exodus 24. Now here we have a dramatic experience. Exodus 24, verse 18. Where was Moses in Exodus 24, verse 18? Anyone know? He was on the mountain, in the cloud. Who was the cloud? The people from below on the mountain saw a devouring fire. But Moses went up into the mountain 40 days and 40 nights in the cloud with God. You think that's dramatic? The people saw a devouring fire, but Moses was in the cloud on the mountain with God for 40 days and 40 nights. I doubt that there's anybody in here that has fasted 40 days and 40 nights. We have another incident later that we'll get to where there was another account like that. But imagine the drama of that all. Again, in God's presence for 40 days and 40 nights. Now we go to Daniel. Daniel 10. Here we have Daniel praying, and here we get a glimpse, and later on we will see some more of that. We get a glimpse. Daniel was fasting for 21 days. He saw a vision, and he was deeply troubled. And we won't go into the vision and all the meaning of that, but he was deeply troubled, and he wanted the interpretation, the meaning of that dream, of that vision. He prayed for 21 days. He fasted and prayed, 3 weeks. And then Gabriel came to him and told him what's happening. Here we get a glimpse of the battle between good and evil. He had been withstood that he could not come to Daniel for 21 days because of evil forces. I'd like to read Daniel chapter 10, verse 3. and a few other verses then. Daniel says, I ate no pleasant bread, no desirable food, neither came flesh nor wine into my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. The way I understand this, Daniel did not even bathe for 3 weeks. He was so committed, fasting and praying, to get an answer that he was all by himself. Yeah, it's quite a story. Then verse 12 and 14. Then this man that Daniel saw, when he was seeking the interpretation, said unto Daniel, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I have come for thy words. Now, this here is just a nugget on prayer. Sometimes we don't get a response from our prayers like we would want to, and at the time we want to. But here, this messenger told Daniel that I heard your words. Your words were heard from the very first day that you uttered them, but I could not come. Now remember, Daniel was 21 days fasting and in prayer for an answer, and he continued in that. But the man said, to chasten thyself before thy God, for thy words were heard, and I have come for thy words. And the prince of the kingdom of Persia, which were the evil forces, withstood me 120 days or 21 days. So he had evil resistance, and this was a messenger from God. Had evil resistance for 21 days until he could come and answer Daniel's prayer. And that gives us a glimpse of the battle between the evil forces and the good forces. And remember, I'll say this now, but remember, when you pursue God to this extent, you are going to be resisted. It's part of it. The battle between good and evil. Daniel 9, verse 20. This is Daniel speaking. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sins of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. And while I was speaking, a man, Gabriel, whom I have seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. Just the confirmation that this messenger from heaven broke through the evil powers and came and answered Daniel's prayer. Now I'd like to go to the New Testament, to Matthew 4. And here we have a very dramatic account, and this is very familiar to us. The temptation of Jesus. Jesus had just been baptized by John the Baptist, and he went into the wilderness. Now remember, this is a man, yes, but this is the Son of God. He was starting his ministry, and he understood his mission. He knew what was to come. He knew that he came from the glories of heaven, became like a man, to give his life for mankind, which comes all the way down to us today. He knew that. So what did he do after his baptism? At the beginning of his ministry, what did he do? He went into the wilderness and he fasted 40 days and 40 nights. When he was extremely hungry, the devil comes. Now, this was not a new person to Jesus, because Jesus had been in heaven. He was there when the devil was cast out. See, the angels, and the devil, Lucifer, was the chief of angels. They have a choice. They can make choices. And he did, and a lot of the angels with him. They were going to become bigger than God. So they were cast out. The difference is they cannot repent from the choice they made. He knew when he was cast out of heaven that he's destined for eternity in the lake of fire. The devil knew that. So here he meets up with Jesus, the Son of God, who's come to redeem mankind from that place. And he was going to do his best to stop him. So at the worst time, at the time when Jesus was most tempted, the devil comes to him and tells Jesus, just take these rocks and make bread. You can eat. And he could have. Do you get a glimpse of the forces that are battling even today? And then we pursue God to this level that we're seeing here, we're going to face that. The devil is going to be upon us. You have any thoughts, questions you want to throw in? I'm open. Going to the disciples in Acts chapter 3, and we studied this in our Sunday school not too long ago. The formative days of the church, they were still in the Old Testament as such. The Gospels that we have today had not been written, so they still just had the Old Testament scriptures. But in Acts 13, the church in a formative stage, they were expanding. They had needs. They had a need of people moving out to carry the gospel. Chapter 13, verse 3, and when they had fasted and prayed, they laid hands on them and they sent them away. This is as they ministered unto the Lord and fasted, the Holy Ghost said, separate unto me Barnabas and Saul, or Paul, for the work whereunto I have called them. So they fasted and prayed, and they sent them on their way. And that's where we get our pattern today, as we practice in the church, when we need to ordain men or missionaries. Fasting and praying is a big part of it. It's got to be. So what is the common thread here? Any thoughts? There's various things that could be said. But what was the common thread in these individuals? Now, these individuals, we look back at them, in the history of them, and we see them as great men and women of God. How did they get there? Was that their pursuit, to become great men and women for God? Probably not just that, but they became that. So what is the common thread in these incidents of people that fasted and prayed? What was one common thread that you see that puts these together in one theme?
Isaiah 58, verse 6. Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, that you break every yoke?
You're running ahead of me, Raymond. That's perfectly fine.
You asked the question.
I know, that's perfectly fine. No problem at all. Yeah, but that's right.
There was this deep, each one of them had this deep need for something. So they needed, like you see, Hannah wanted a son, Daniel was praying for direction. They understood that they didn't have answers for what need they had. They were, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, true, thank you.
I find it interesting, too, that fasting is not just for the individual. There's just as many times, it seems like, where the fasting is done for someone else.
Yes.
Or another group.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That wasn't something I really thought about.
Yeah, there were fasts for revival. But on the individual, and Mark, that was very well stated, and Raymond, I thank you for those thoughts. It was the outpouring of themselves. in the fast. And we talk about seeking God. I like the term pursuing God, running after God. These individuals, they were great individuals for God, but the whole process was, this was their life. This was their pursuit. And that's what brought them to these places. That's how they knew where to go and where to reach to for their answers and the needs that they had. And that's true for us today. As we pursue God, we're going to face situations that are over and above us. And that's where we come in, where we sacrifice, we deny ourselves and we sacrifice in pursuing after God. Fasting and prayer lifts us into the realms of the heavenly. On each occasion, these individuals were reaching for God, like Mark said, for a power, for a source that was over and above them. Seeking the holy God is not about becoming great men. It is that. It's not about name and reputation. It's the result of pursuing after God. True revelation from God is not self-exalting. It's humbling. That's the pursuit that we want. It doesn't happen by being a part of the church or a small group or attending services. It doesn't happen that way. That's good. That helps. But it happens on an individual basis where we pursue God in that way. And like I said, it's like fasting isn't easy. But when we're in pursuit of God, we get to those places where we find we can sacrifice. In their pursuit of God, fasting became a part of their life. It's about self-denial. There was an incident, and if you read it in Matthew 17, where this individual came to Jesus and said, I have this son that is epileptic, and he has fits, he's demon-possessed, and the disciples couldn't cast him out. Can you help me? And Jesus did. Then the disciples came back and said, why couldn't we do that? Jesus said, he called them I forget the perverse nation, lack of faith. And then he has this term where it says, if you have the faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move, and it'll be removed. So what do we focus on when we read that verse? We see the mountain. We'd like to move this thing. That's not the emphasis at all. The faith of the grain of mustard seed is the tiniest of all seeds that I know of, but a mustard seed grows. So the faith, the little faith that we have, if we exercise, it will grow. And Jesus said, whatever we ask for, he will do it. In Mark 8, it talks about taking up our cross and following after Jesus, denying ourselves. That's actually pursuing after Jesus. Some more thoughts. We usually don't forget to eat. We forget our keys, we forget our phones, we forget many things, but we don't forget to eat. In John 6, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whosoever comes to me will never hunger, will never go hungry, and whosoever believes in me will never thirsty. In fasting, when we go into the fast, when your physical hunger calls for food, it's a signal for you to go for spiritual food. That's one purpose or reason for fasting. We deprive ourselves so that it actually gets our attention because we love to eat, but it gets our attention so we can focus on spiritual things, reading the Word, meditating, because if we don't fill that space with that hunger, with a pursuit of God or for His Word, it's just skipping a meal. In Joel 2, verse 12, was a message for Israel and for us. He says, "Return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning." We live in an age when everything is accessible with the touch of a button. We get it instantly. You order something from Amazon, and in seconds, the order is confirmed, and in days you have it, if not the next day. What are you willing to do without in order to gain Christ? That's a personal question. What am I willing to do without in order to gain Christ? We go without to remember that we go with God. Jesus went without for 40 days and 40 nights to be with God, to be empowered. Jesus felt that need, that he needed to be empowered by God to fulfill his mission. He went without food, physical food, even though he was the Son of God. He was the Son of Man. He went without physical food in pursuit of strength. How preoccupied are you with your pursuit of enough? Enough in the pantry, enough money, enough stuff. How preoccupied are you with your pursuit of enough? In Matthew 14, we read about this great banquet that this man made. And the guests that he had invited couldn't come because of all kinds of excuses. You know the story. So he told his servants, and they had enough stuff. He had everything well prepared. So he told his servants, go out in the highways and hedges and compel the people to come in. And they did. They brought him in off the streets. Then the servants came back to their master and said, what you have ordered, we have done. There is still room. Do you get the message? There's still room at the king's table. Pursue him. Let's pursue him individually, collectively. Let's pursue him. There's room for everyone. There's still room for improvement in our lives, to draw closer to God. There's room. Let's move forward. Now, Raymond, we'll go back to Isaiah 58. That's okay. I'm glad you spoke up. The reason I'm reading this, I'm going to read a portion of this. The reason I'm reading this is because the title in my Bible of this chapter is The Blessing of True Worship. And they were fasting. Isaiah writes to the children of Israel, you seek me daily, you delight in my ways as a nation. Verse 2. Verse 3, wherefore have we fasted, they say, and thou seest not. Wherefore have we afflicted our souls, and thou takest no knowledge. They were practicing the fast. They were doing it. Then in verse 6 he says, there we start in, is not this the fast that I have chosen? Notice the very common things that are happening here. To loose the bands of wickedness, and to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, that ye break every yoke. Is it not to share bread with the hungry, that thou bring the poor that are cast out into thine house? When thou seest the naked, that thou may cover them, and thou hide not thyself from thine own people. This is the fast that God is talking about, active, living faith. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall reward thee. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and he shall say, Here I am. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, pointing fingers, and speaking vanity. If thou draw out thy soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. The Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach and the restorer of the path to dwell in. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, not finding thine own pleasure, not speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. That concludes my topic. If I sounded preachy, I'm sorry. Do you have any questions? Yes. Thank you. Why was that?
Why was that? Because he was spending time with the Lord.
You also notice that it was at the end of the 40 days. And I didn't get into that because, yeah, but thank you for bringing that in. There was so much happening on those 40 days in the wilderness that we do not read about. That is, if you meditate and think about it. But anyway, thank you for your attention.